So we just talked about the most important elements of a slide in management consulting. What we want to do now is that we talk about how you can structure a slide, how you can build a slide. And before we do that, keep in mind that every slide has a key message. And this is the most important thing, okay? Before you work on a slide, sit down and think about what is the key message of a slide. What you then do is that you draw an action title. This doesn't have to be the final action title because very often in the process you still have to adjust it, but this should be, just an outline of what you want to show. What you do then is that you think about an illustration in the content section, in the body of your slide, that supports the key message. And this is exactly what we refer to when we talked about vertical storylines, okay? It's the storyline on a slide, it's an illustration on a slide that supports the key message. So to make your process, if you build slides, much easier, I highly recommend that you always first sit down, think about the key message, draw the action title, and then think about, okay, what type of illustration might be suitable to illustrate or to provide details for this key message in the best possible way. And there are several types that we typically, or several illustration types that we typically use in consulting. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And of course, you can structure your slide also in a very individual way, but those are like the main clusters, I would say, that you typically see in consulting. And what you also do, but we will talk about that in a separate chapter, is that you work with slide libraries. So very often your company that you work with has a slide library where you have certain templates for those categories, for those different formats that you simply can include, and then you already have a structure. But the key thing is, and this is the difficult thing at the beginning, is to choose what kind of or what type of illustration is the best one to support your key message. And there are several formats that you could use. So the first one I want to talk about are columns. And this is important, this is helpful, especially if you want to illustrate 2 or 5 aspects on a slide. So I use that very often if I talk about different parts, for example. We just talked about the profitability analysis that we did in our example project. There, for example, we could talk about 4 main regions, okay? Maybe you want to talk about those 4 regions, include a little bit of information about those regions, and there I would use probably this column illustration. Maybe at the top a picture of the country, or something that gives a little bit of illustration, just the name of the country, and then maybe below that in bullet formats the key findings of the analysis. Okay, so this could be an example where you use those columns. Another very common format that you have is if you want to talk or is using lists, and this is especially suitable if you have more items that you want to talk about. So maybe you just want to list 5 to 10 items on a slide. And this is very often done by using list formats. And in our example, for example, this could be illustrating the quality issues that we have. So we talked about, okay, one reason for the decreasing revenues are the quality issues that we see in the company. And if you just want to list those quality issues and maybe write 1 sentence about that, just to give an overview about those quality issues, then I would probably use a list format. Then the next one is that you use boxes around a circle. And this helps if you want to show several aspects that are linked together or are circled around a certain topic. So maybe if you talk about an environmental analysis that you did, so maybe you want to illustrate, okay, we took a view on the macro trends that we see, and then you maybe have the company in the middle, and then your 4 boxes around that could be maybe the economic trends that you see, the technological trends that you see, maybe some legal things that you see, and some environmental things that you see. Okay, and this is probably an example where I would use this illustration, where I have in the middle a point that I want to talk about, and besides that, around it, I would have the 4 aspects or maybe 5 aspects or 6 aspects, it doesn't matter, I want to talk about. The next one is that you use an illustration that shows oppositions. So this is typically, just that you have on the left side some points, on the right side some points. And I would use that if I want to show some arguments that stand against each other. So for example, let's say that you questioned people, and maybe you went into the organization, did some interviews about the situation of the company. Maybe you want to analyze the culture of the company, and then you could list some pros and some cons. Okay, maybe some positive aspects versus some negative aspects. And this is an illustration that I would typically show or use if I want to show opposite or contrasting arguments. Then the next part would be that you have a slide that shows illustrations. So if you want to show a graph and if you want to describe the graph, then you typically use this 2/3, 1/3 logic. Of course, this could also be half and half, but this means that you have on one box, you have a graphical illustration, and in the other box, you have a description in a bullet point format. And an example would be if I talk about the profitability decrease, for example, I could show on the left side a graph that shows the decrease in profitability, and on the right side I just have a list of bullet points that provides a little bit of context, that provides some additional information about the decreasing profitability. Then to go to the next step or to the next format type that you can use is that you use circles. And this is similar to using boxes, but the point here is that you have more points. And I like to use that especially if we talk about some more brainstorming related issues or topics, or if I just want to highlight some or several aspects around a certain topic. So usually if I say, okay, there is a problem and there are several aspects that we have to consider around that problem, then I would use such a illustration. So I have maybe the core problem in the middle, and then more like a brainstorming around that, I could list all the reasons or all the aspects that we have to consider in order to solve this problem. Okay, this could be an example where you use those circles. Then the next one that is very often used are processes. And this is similar to columns, but the difference is that you show a sequence of steps. So maybe if you want to talk about the next steps that you need to do, then you show those 4 processes, and then you have some bullet points below that to explain the process. Or also, if you just want to discuss an actual process, this is also what you typically use to illustrate your point. Then something that we also use in consulting is called a call-out illustration. So what is that? A call-out illustration is similar to the illustration framework, but the difference is that you have the illustration in the middle, and around that you have comment boxes that point to a certain point in the graphic and where you have a descriptive text. And this is what we call call-outs. And the situation where you typically use that, if you have a very complex graphic where you really need to point to certain aspects within the graphic that you want to explain. So for example, if you have a very complex illustration, or for example, if you have an org chart, an organizational chart with all those different organizational boxes, and you want to highlight certain problems in a specific org box, then you could illustrate the org chart in the middle, use a call out that directly points to the org box or organizational box that you want to talk about, and then include a comment on the side what the actual issue is. And this is an illustration, or this is a situation where I would use call outs. Then in more general, you can also use frameworks. And here it's really up to your creativity. Depending on the type of problem that you use, you can use different frameworks. So for example, very common is to use a BCG matrix, or if we talk about a marketing issue, you use the 4P framework. there are several frameworks that you can use in order to make your point. And there you typically have just the framework in the middle, and besides that or around that you have the information. And typically your company, if you join consulting, has a lot of those framework slides that they typically use. Also probably your project manager has certain frameworks that he likes to use, but this is another way of building slides. And last but not least, we have hierarchies. So especially if we talk about different aspects that we want to show in a hierarchical order, you can use those pyramid slides, maybe where you have the pyramid on one slide and then some descriptive aspects. And this is, for example, if we talk about let's say a governance process that you want to, or governance concept that you want to optimize, where you have several layers of governance. This is something that I would probably show in such a hierarchical slide. So those are the most common slides that, based on my experience, we see in management consulting. So keep in mind that you always think about the key message first, and that you then think about, okay, what kind of illustration type do you use? Then very often you have a kind of template that you can just include, and this should be the basis of your slide. And then of course you adjust those templates. Of course you include information, you individualize your slides. It's not that every slide looks the same, but the key thing is to think in that structure, to think about what kind of illustration can I use to support the key message. And here it really helps to have those kind of illustrations in mind, and to, you know, get used to thinking about in slide structures. So as soon as you know what the key message is, that you directly know, okay, what kind of slide format would be suitable for that. This just takes some time and takes some practice, but the earlier you start thinking in those slide structures, the quicker you will be over the time.